me and Ben, and I just finished reading the article because I forgot it was Sunday. So a couple of weeks ago, I was arguing with friend of the show, Doug Lane, on an extra hour for our magazine show, and we were arguing about, as me and Doug do. I was defending the Soviet Union and free will and compatibilism specifically, while Doug was attacking those two. And Doug said, he basically implied that I didn't really believe in compatibilism, and that it was just kind of something I said to kind of rescue human freedom from kind of abandon, like, you want to keep human freedom because it's useful for various things, and kind of we're lost without it, but you don't really believe it. But what I think about is most interesting about compatibilism is that Doug is wrong here, and that I really do believe in compatibilism, like right down to my bones. I really, really believe in it, but I can very easily see why some people don't.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take the sensible centrist position, which is yes on compatibilism, no on Stalinism. But
wow, this is very rude to Khrushchev.
Yeah. Well, even in the Khrushchev era, as they say, mistakes were made. But in any case, yeah. So we should
That was
say
very loud, whatever that was.
That was
that
the digging of this message. Let me just hit that. Yeah, app. So yeah. So I should say, for anybody who's tuned in and has no idea either, what we're talking about in terms of the underlying issue, or what we're talking about in terms of the setup, So for the last month or so, I've been doing this philosophy Substack, philosophy for the people, every Sunday afternoon in America, and some other time of day, whatever that weird country is that Stefan is in. We are talking about the essays, and this one is about compatibilism partially, right? It's about this sort of more general issue about free will, and specifically, it's about Sam Harris and a book that he wrote about free will, and a lecture that he gave about it, that you can find on YouTube, and why the arguments that he makes in those places against free will, and specifically against compatibilism, I don't think are very convincing, right? But I guess just the last little bit of scene setting we should probably do is, okay, we say compatibilism. What, that's not a household word, right? I mean, what is that?
Compatible with what? With what?
Yeah, exactly. So, to be a compatibilist about something is to think the two things are compatible. In this case, the things that are thought to be compatible are determinism and free will. So if and it is funny, I was thinking about what you were describing. I think actually both a good way of maybe introducing, like, sort of easing into what compatibilism is, and also maybe a good way of pushing against, making your point that no, Doug is wrong, you really do believe this to your bones, is by thinking about just kind of a goofy example. Like, if you think, like, let's say you're gonna meet your friend for lunch, and you've made plans, you picked a restaurant, all this stuff. You show up. We'll set this example before the age of smartphones, so like there's no way to easily get in touch with him, and you're sitting there for like an hour, 2 hours, and just never shows up. Track him down. So what the hell? What the hell, man? We had plans. And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't." You say, "Oh, what do you mean you couldn't?" He said, "Well, you see, everything that ever happens, decision making in the human brain, is a result of complex chains of cause and effect. And so from the Big Bang singularity up until my deciding that I didn't feel like going to lunch, There were these unbreakable chains of cause and effect. Therefore, there's no sense in which I could have done it. Therefore, it's not my fault. I think most of us would be very uncompelled by that, and would be very uncompelled by that, not because we disagree with the empirical claim about like how physics works. I think even if you just maybe you think that, maybe you don't, but I mean, like, even if you completely put yourself into that deterministic mindset, you just sort of accept, at least for the sake of argument, that yes, absolutely, the indeterministic readings of quantum physics or whatever are wrong, right? Like, everything that ever happens, it's all like those like word problems in high school physics classes about the bat hits the baseball at such and such velocity and blah blah blah, right? If you know all the starting points and you know all the physical laws, you know what you're going to end up with, and there's no what had the decision making of the human brain isn't some special magical exception to these general laws of cause and effect. If a supercomputer was tracking the position of every molecule in the universe at time t1, it would be able to spit out, the positions of all the molecules in the universe at time t2. All that stuff. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about cause and effect, right? Causal determinism. You wouldn't really accept that as the right kind of "I couldn't" to get your friend off the hook. And there are different ways of parsing what's going on here, and it could just be that we're all just deeply incoherent about this. There are, that possibility. But it could also be that the conception of freedom that we're working with intuitively, even if we don't realize it, even if it seems confusing when we start to reflect on it philosophically, is actually a compatibilist one. In other words, it's one that says that, yes, even if every single thing that ever happens is completely deterministic, that it's always the case that there's always a chain of cause and effect, and it's always the case that given the earlier links in that chain, the later links are unavoidable. You still think that some human decisions, not all, but some, seem like things that people are in control over in the right way to be responsible for them. And there's a lot.
I was thinking, like, as if I wasn't doing this podcast with you, but I was doing this podcast with Sam Harris. And if you asked him, like, Sam, did you choose to have me on the podcast today? And he might catch himself and stop himself from saying,
if you were talking about free will, he would, in that context, he'd be
he would catch himself. But if I was there to talk about privilege, about the woke moralist or whatever, he'd probably say yes. Or if I asked him, if he chose to start the podcast, like, and if and I tried to get him to kind of explain why he did so, he would tell this kind of human story about his own choices, about his own kind of capacities as a human to choose between various options. And he might catch himself, but it does seem it's people. I think there is one conception encouraged very much by Sam Harris, which is presumably something we're going to talk about, that compatibilism is just kind of philosophical word games. But everyone really knows, if they think about it, that compatibilism isn't true, that compatibilism is changing the definition of free will. But I think it's true, as you're making clear, as you say in the essay, that in fact, compatibilism completely coheres with our usual sort of language. Like, you use the example of, I could have made that shot, talking about a basketball game. And as opposed to the idea that compatibilism has this ridiculous idea of could, like, compatibilists, for the people watching, compatibilists assert normally that we could have done otherwise. And the free will skeptic will say, well, no, obviously you fucking couldn't, mate. You couldn't have done otherwise because blah, 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 metaphysics. But obviously how we actually use that word in common human language, when I say I could have made that shot in basketball, when I said I could have gone to the shops today, when I say use this word, I could have done this, I could have done that, I could have done otherwise, what we mean there is we're not defying the laws of physics. determinism, and so on, we're describing kind of an internal process which goes on where we make choices based on our desires via kind of like a process of human reason.
Yeah, no, I think so. So, I mean, I think there's an interesting question here, because definitely one of the arguments that Sam Harris makes against compatibilism is just, like there's a lot of rolling basically in that book, but like a big chunk of it is just like Ocon. That's obviously not what ordinary people mean when they talk about free will. That it's this is like, sure, this is some philosopher's trick that we can like play with words to make things come out a certain way, but you're just like, you've just gone this huge distance for what we all ordinarily mean, which is interesting. I should say, one of the things I find interesting about this argument is that even as he makes it, right, like he also thinks that we can see that we don't have free will just by reflecting on ordinary experience.
Which he gives various wacky examples for.
Yeah, he gives terrible examples for. We could get into one of those in a second, but it's like, I think it's a really bad argument, but like, but I just wanted to note before we do that, like, yeah, okay, so this is a weird view that you're saying that on the one hand, most people believe in free will, and on the other hand, what they mean by it is this like really demanded notion that it would be really hard for anything to actually count as. And 3, it's just sort of trivially easy to see from like reflected in your conscious experience that we don't meet that bar. So it's like, well, hold on. If it's that easy, I mean, how stupid do you think most people are? I mean, that they just...
Right. It's quite a kind of post-Foucauldian kind of, if we just reveal the violence in the system, then...
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. Like it's like, yeah, I mean, actually there's an interesting analogy there, but yeah, I think that, it is just funny, like how easy he thinks it is to show that we don't have, like the way that he understands free will, is that you have to be, like, you have to be consciously aware of why you're making a decision in order for it to count as free. It has to be sort of like present to your awareness, and you have to, and also he's very explicit about this. There's this sort of deep. It's like it has to be that that you could have done otherwise, and as I'm sure we'll get to, and as you kind of already did a little bit, right? There are lots of different ways that you could understand that phrase, could have done otherwise, but it has to be that you could have done otherwise in this like super demanded sense that you have to have, that it has to be the case, like given
in the exact same circumstances.
What's that?
In the exact same circumstances, you must have done otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. The exact same circumstances. So like, like just neuron by neuron, the state of your brain at the time that you made the decision was exactly the same, and everything about the world around you was the same. Everything was the same, right? Everything has to be the same, and that all of like, that it has to be possible that like just given the sort of total state of the universe, included atom by atom, neuron by neuron, the total state of you, that you could have done otherwise at the time that you made the decision. And I agree with him that we definitely don't have that kind of free will, right? But then he thinks, I even agree with some of his reasons for thinking we don't, although I think some of them miss the mark completely. But I mean, I think there's a sort of general sense in which, sure, like the more you learn about science, the more things you can sort of provide complete causal explanations for, right? Here's the sort of here are all the causes that led to this thing happening. I always say, like, when I haven't actually taught it in-person intro class in a while, but like when I used to, right, I always to sort of motivate people to take determinism seriously as a possibility. I always say, like, look, imagine that your car breaks down and you take it to the mechanic, and he says there's nothing wrong with the battery, there's nothing wrong with the engine, there's nothing wrong with the alternator, there's nothing wrong with the belts. It just stopped working. You would think, oh my God, I learned a new thing about reality today. That sometimes, cars just stop working with no cause. You think that's not a very good mechanic. I want to find a better one, who could help me. Or even if, for the sake of argument, you think that like something really mysterious happened to your car, you'd still think that there is an explanation waiting to be found, even if a good mechanic for whatever reason couldn't figure it out, right? So the question is, well, is decision making in the human brain going to be like that? Yeah, I think that's extremely plausible. There are people who think otherwise and who aren't like idiots. I just think they're wrong. So like the Robert Kane view I mentioned in the essay. I should say, by the way, one thing that's likely to be super confusing here is that the free will debate involves a lot of words that also have political meanings, and so I can see, especially
the libertarians don't want child brides or anything. Don't worry.
Yeah, not that kind of libertarians. Exactly. I say sort of uncharitably, perhaps in the essay, that political philosophy and libertarianism refers to the view that the right of rich people to keep all their money is more important than the right of poor people to not starve to death. And so I feel sort of bad for the free will libertarians that they share with that, but just in a totally different sense.
You are just innocently wrong.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's so much more innocent kind of wrongness than the political and economic libertarians. But yeah, libertarians in this sense, just like the liberty in that kind of libertarian is free will, right? We're of our actions, and libertarians roughly think that we have the kind of free will that Sam Harris has in mind when Sam Harris says we don't have free will. And so that we have the kind of free will where, in order to have it, the bar for having it is that you have to have this like extremely strict, like, okay, given like everything more or less, right? You could have done otherwise. And so there are some forms of libertarianism about free will that are, I think, extremely silly. That people like sort of, once they start talking about, it's like, oh, there's some sort of third magical form of causation that's like not deterministic and it's not just probabilistic random, but it's like some third thing that it's like really, really in charge of us. And sometimes when they like really, start to go off on that, it gets very mysterious, what that could be.
Right. I must say I don't know how libertarianism is meant to work. I'm not sure if libertarians know either.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely libertarians who don't really know how it's meant to work, right? Because they'll sort of start, they'll sort of start saying things about how there's this special kind of agent causation that's different from events causing each other, or that there's a God, I'm trying to remember. Robert Chris Holmes has a weird phrase about the self. It's like the self-actualizing non-causal power centers or something, and it's like, okay.
I mean, it kind of works quite a lot more if you assume that you have a Christian soul or whatever. But it's kind of the people who don't think that I find the most interesting. But I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I want to be charitable here, and like because there is a sort of version of this that's like okay, we're all sort of little. We all sort of more or less work the way that that like Christian mystics think that God does, right? We're uncaused causers of other things, and sure doesn't seem like that to me, right? So if that's what you mean by free will, then I'm on Team Sam Harris there, I suppose. But to be charitable about this, the most plausible version of libertarianism that I know of comes from this guy Robert Kane, who says who is not saying anything sort of strange and mystical. I think he's just like maybe wrong, and even if he's not wrong about a lot of the assumptions that he's making empirically, then I still just think he's wrong to like think that all of this would have to be true, for us to have free will. But he'll say, he's got this view where you have where he says, okay, sure, fair enough. Most of the time, most human behavior is just on a sort of autopilot that you're just going around acting without all that much, you don't like sit around agonizing about most of your decisions, right? You just sort of go around.
But sometimes the neuron activates.
Yeah. By and large, you're just acting, and it's causally determined by pre-existing facts about your behavior. And fair enough. But he thinks that sometimes there are special decisions where that's not the case, and so he assumes that a deterministic interpretation of quantum physics is true, which is the first place to flag, like, okay, how sure are you about that, right? I don't like particularly feel the need, like I don't have a lot of even as somebody who's sort of professionally in the business of having opinions, I'm pretty happy not to have a lot of opinions about theoretical physics.
I do actually have a worry with quantum mechanics and human freedom, but my worry is that it might make determinism false. And if determinism is false, then human freedom is potentially kind of in danger, which shows how far down the compatibilism rabbit hole I am.
Yeah, God is so compatibilist that you're an incompatibilist about free will and indeterminism. I'm taking my compatibilism in moderation. I don't know if I'd worry about that, but yeah. So he assumes that an indeterministic reading of quantum physics is true, and that this is going to have like certain kinds of effects in like the human brain. Second empirical assumption that he could just be wrong about, right? That it could be the case that we're talking about subatomic particles. Then sure, there's like a certain element of randomness, but that could be true without that having anything to do with what's going on.
I mean, Sean Carroll famously says that if you're looking for human freedom or you're looking for freedom, don't look at particles, because we understand the particles more or less perfectly, but the thing we don't understand is the brain. So don't go looking in the particles to like free up the brain, because we know exactly how they work.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a funny, like, I mean, how much, I mean, as I understand it, some of this is like an open empirical question, like if the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the one that says that it is deterministic at subatomic level, there aren't any hidden variables that make it like deterministic on a deeper level. There aren't like multiple universes split off to keep, so there's like determinism that in like a really weird way or whatever, right? Like that, but it really is indeterministic at the subatomic level. That even if you think that's true, my understanding, as again somebody who's not particularly invested in having takes on controversies in theoretical physics, that it's a somewhat open question how much that's going to filter up to have effects. How much that's going to filter up to have effects on things like what's going on in the brain, or other kinds of physical processes that are at levels that are of more interest to us than the subatomic on a day-to-day basis. But Kane thinks that uncertain circumstances where we're sort of like torn between like warring preferences, like he has this example a woman who's on her way to this important job interview, and she passes somebody who needs medical attention in the streets, and she's like really torn what to do. And in a way, this is like very like Aristotelian kind of Foucault psychology that's going on here. That he thinks under those circumstances where the sort of causal gears are sort of at loggerheads because of these warring desires, that this quantum indeterminacy can sometimes mean that it's genuinely undetermined what's going to happen in your brain, and he thinks that these are so that these are special. These tend to happen in these cases. These special self-forming actions, SFAs, and those are kind of the times that you're setting the you're like setting the dials on your cognitive autopilot. And so even though most of the time we're on autopilot, we can still be indirectly responsible because we could have done otherwise, because we could have set the dials on the autopilot differently in the special SFAs. And to be clear, I think that there is an excellent chance that none of this is true. Like there's a...
Right. But that's enough about kind of the best defense of a weak position. Let's go to the worst defense of a weak position, which is Sam Harris's view in free will.
Yeah, exactly.
I think very similar to Jordan Peterson. What I find most interesting about Sam Harris is kind of, from my perspective, what are kind of very bad arguments for his position, but on the other hand, his massive popularity. So he's obviously someone that comes up a lot on Reddit as philosophy. You give one very wacky example in the book of where he tries to disprove free will by making us like randomly think about something, which is like exactly not the kind of action that we normally classify within free. Like kind of this is like kind of the opposite of a prototypical example of a free will action.
Totally, yeah. So he says. So I embed the YouTube video of this lecture around the time the book came out, where he does this. This always drove me crazy because it's like I am so confused by how he thinks this works, but I do think like part of it, right? Sam Harris, who I do say like 2.5 nice things about in the essay, although the vast majority of it is devoted to giving him a hard time for the various about of which I really do think there are like a lot. This is one example that I care about, but there was a time when my friends Mark Ward and Ryan Lake and I were actually talking about this is like years before I started my own podcast or whatever. We were going to start a website or a podcast that was going to be called Sam Harris's Always Wrong, and it would just. But
the thing is, compared to most of the people he speaks to, he's the sensible one.
He is. He totally is, right? I mean, like he's added this sort of original intellectual dark web, which is a sort of weird kind of half joking media branding exercise from a few years ago. But it's also like it was very much a self-conscious branding exercise that he and the rest of these guys participated in. It's not like just somebody like randomly applied this label to him while he had nothing to do with it. He definitely did participate in the photo shoots and all that, for the original New York Times article, where he and the rest of these guys are sort of standing shredded darkness, kind of going like this, and they have a look at these dark, edgy thinkers and the important truths they're revealing. But I think that if you compare him to like some of the people he was hanging out with back then, look. I mean, God, if I had to pick, it's like a little bit like one of these like,
well, like fuck, marry, kill kind of things.
Yeah, right. So it's like, look, if I have to pick, I'll go with Sam Harris because like he's if you look at the kind of issues that he fell out with these guys about, it's like they all believe like crazy shit about like COVID and the 2020 election. Yeah. So it's like, it's more reasonable than them.
Sam Harris at least has kind of like a grip on kind of consensus reality.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, and I actually do think that for better or for worse, he has been completely consistent over the decades. That he has that like I actually don't think he's like particularly audience captured the way that some of these guys get, where they just have to like they sort of start saying increasingly insane shit to like pander to their audience. I think that he just has his views, which I think are probably pretty authentic because they make a lot of sense for, I just say a little unkindly in the essay that you probably can't, toss an empty Starbucks cup in Santa Monica without hitting somebody who thinks exactly what Sam Harris does about all of these questions, right? That like because he's like basically just a technocratic sort of liberal who thinks that like he sort of distrusts populism of all kinds, and he takes it for granted
and kind of popular wisdom too.
Yeah. He takes it for granted that because he reveres science and experts, and he thinks that we should all be deferring to experts more, and again, it's this very technocratic kind of centrist liberalism that like I'm sure Sam Harris was probably one of the people who was like, oh my God, how is this? How is Hillary Clinton not winning this election? She's the most qualified candidate, in the history of candidates. And he takes it for granted that we live in a scary world, and the U.S. military is a benevolent force in that world, and even on Israel-Palestine, where I think a more thoughtful version of some of his views might lead in a different direction, right? I mean, he's like, there's these like scary irrational Muslims creep me out, like they like there are all these Israelis who seem like the kind of people that I'm used to, like that they would fit right in, right? So all of which is just to say, I vehemently dislike Sam Harris's view of the world. It is very different from mine, but I also think that sort of has its own sort of internal way of making sense. That like once you kind of get it, all of his positions fall into place. I would argue, by the way, including the free will stuff, that like there's this sort of there's this very kind of utilitarian view of morality that like fits in.
Right, it fits very well with like the political kind of superstructure of his ideology, right?
Yeah, that exactly.
Kind of, if you take away free will from people, then it becomes much easier to turn everyone into like a number.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this package of views does internally to his assumptions make sense. I just think that his assumptions suck. And you kind of mentioned earlier, and I know we were getting you'd asked me about the particular argument I start the essay with, but that argument is he asked people, and you brought up earlier, it's like, okay, why is it that he's making some goofy ass arguments? Why is this so popular? Right? Why is this so compelling to so many people? And I think there are probably a few reasons for that. I mean, this is the same question you kind of raised last week about Jordan Peterson, although it's a very different answer, I think, in the Harris case. But part of it's just that, look, Sam Harris is a very gifted communicator. He's a good writer. I think he's a good enough writer to mask a lot of really bad arguments.
I think that really comes out when kind of on Reddit Asks Philosophy, kind of one of his followers has to repeat his views, and they don't have his talents. And you're like, that sounds ridiculous, what you're saying. And they're like, oh yeah, it kind of does, right? You give the example of that he gives in this lecture, but I think if you'd read it, you definitely would have given a more recent example he gives, where basically he tries to disprove free will through this kind of like Zen Buddhist internal reflection kind of thing, where he thinks if we look kind of inside of ourselves, we can't know what our next thought is going to be.
Yeah, no, exactly. So he has I mean, he's got like, so his argument, what he does in this lecture is he asks people to pick a city, right? Is like just like think of a city and he has, again, he's a good writer, he's a good speaker, he's very smooth, very forceful in his presentation, and there's something very like calming, right, about his demeanor. It's kind of, we were talking about Jordan Peterson last week. It's kind of the opposite in some ways of the Peterson. Peterson's such a weird hysteric, but yeah, he sort of asked people to reflect on, okay, you just picked a city, right? And he makes this very weird claim that if anything's free will, it's this, because there's no compulsion from the external world. It's just you and your thoughts, right? So if this wasn't a free decision, then nothing is a free decision. Which, put a fucking pin in that, because I think that is as wrong could possibly be. But
it only seems to take kind of the negative things, like a freedom from compulsion, right, without the very important positive side, which is like reasons to pick one thing over another. And if I'm being told to pick a random example, I'm trying to pick randomly. I'm trying to pick without reason, like it's the same thing as that kind of thing where it's like, oh, your body chooses if you're going to randomly move your left hand or your right hand before your brain takes the decision. You're like, that makes sense, but that's not freedom, is it?
Yeah. No, exactly, right? So it's like he says, you don't have any control over which cities happen to float up to the surface of your mind, or like which one of those sort of strikes your fancy at the moment. About which I would say, yeah, correct, right? You don't. Nobody has ever thought you do, Sam. Like, this is like, I don't know what this argument is directed against. That this isn't the kind of thing that any halfway plausible account of free will is claiming is free will, because for exactly the reason you just said, that not in when you like what the prompt is essentially open up your mind to whatever whim happens to skitter across it and then report back to me.
Right.
And it's like, okay, if people are playing the game they're being asked to play, then there's no planning or deliberating courses of action or reasoning or any of that stuff that people actually care about when they care about free will, right? That's when you talk about, being in control of your actions. I mean, that's all the stuff that people are really thinking of. And so it's like, yeah, no shit. You don't have any, free will there. Why think that you do? And I think, and, I contrasted the essay with a classic example from Jean-Paul Sartre, who in his essay Existentialism as a Humanism, about a student of his during the Nazi occupation of France who was torn between staying and taking care of his mother, who, he was the only support left for her, and going off to join the Free French Army to fight the Nazis. And how, it was like different kinds of senses of duty were pulling at him. He was trying to figure out what to do. Sartre, I think, was massively unhelpful to him in this, right? I don't think he actually helped.
I mean, Sartre was not a good person, and and was no delusion on his part. He knew he was a bad person, and that's quite obvious writing.
I think Sartre probably gave him a little speech about how we have to you're alone with your freedom, and you have to decide what to like this is how you create yourself or something, which is nice, but whatever you think about that philosophically, that's not useful to somebody in that circumstance. But
I'm very glad that you included this in the article, because I think it's very important to kind of, that's I think the other interesting part in terms of popular take-up, that there's lots of people online who read Sam Harris and then are convinced they don't have free will and become like quite depressed or anxious about it. Yeah. And it's like, you should be anxious, but you're anxious about completely the wrong thing. The problem isn't that you're unfree. The problem is that you're free and that you have so much responsibility and kind of like a world on your shoulders.
yeah, I mean, Sartre's view is that this is like a really distressing thing about the human condition, that we have, that in fact we're sort of, thrown into the world, and kind of, yeah, he says condemned to be free, that you have to make these decisions, that you have to sort of create the world around you, even, sort of without assistance, and there's something that is incredibly anxiety provoking about it. But the reason, that I was using Sartre here as the example, probably have kinder feelings to him maybe than you do, but I have but might have been a little sketchy in his personal life.
Oh no, I
but,
think he's a good philosopher. I don't really mind about him being a bad person. It's just funny to bring up.
Fair enough. We'll do the. I think we can skip is Sartre in heaven for this week, and just talk about the philosophy. But like, one of the reasons that I'm bringing him up is that this is a guy who is, in terms of the sort of philosophical tradition he's in, the concerns he has, what he's trying to argue for, is like completely different from where I'm sort of phoning in from, right? I mean, like, this is this is the continental philosopher's continental philosopher, and he's certainly not trying to argue for compatibilism, I mean, or anything like that, right? Like, that's not at all the point. He's asking different questions about free will. To the extent that he's asking the same questions, his answers are just wildly different, from what I give in a lot of ways. But nevertheless, this is something that, like, that's the kind of thing that people are actually thinking about when thinking about free will, right? I mean, there's a reason why this is a kind of prototypical example, because, just to circle and underline what you just said, I mean, this isn't just like, oh, whatever whim thoughtlessly takes me in the moment, right? I mean, like, which is so much of Harris, but not just the lecture in the book, right? He's like, oh, I don't really know. I stopped practicing martial arts when I was younger, and then I picked it back up again. I don't really know why, It's like, yeah.
It's like, if that's true, man, like, why am I bothering talking to you? If you're not in charge, can you show me to who is? Like,
Can I? Yeah, you want to? Oh, Karen here wants to talk to Sam Harris's manager. Yeah, but yeah, right. No, I do think he's probably underselling his degree of agency about some of this stuff. But, like, look, there's some truth to that. I mean, like, I think that people look, quite a bit of what we do in life, even some important things, is we're just kind of thoughtlessly going with the flow. Fair enough, right? But that's not the dimension. That's not the subset of human experience that we're interested in when we ask this question about free will. Right? What we're interested in is, are our capacities for, like, reasoning and planning and all of that stuff, right? I mean, those are the capacities that we're interested in when we ask these questions about free will. I mean, like typically free will is something that we think, like, we think adult human beings under a recognizable range of circumstances who aren't suffering from severe mental incapacities, et cetera, like, those are the people that we think, oh, you're responsible for what you do because you did it of your own free will. Whereas, like, we have, my miniature schnauzer Lucy certainly has preferences and desires, but we don't really think that she's in control of her actions in the same way, right? That's like, she's not deliberating about whether to start barking at the squirrel, and there's, like, and we think that, like, young children, because they at least have, they might have the capacities to some extent, but it's diminished, right? We don't think that they're doing things of their own free will in quite the same way, and et cetera, right? So, like, I think that when Harris takes us outside of the domain of reasoning and planning, deliberating over different courses of action, I think he's taking us I think he's the one, right? Like the compatibilism chapter in his book is called Changing the Subject. But I think he's the one who's changing the subject, right? He's talking about something very different from what I think people typically have in mind when they talk about free
Right.
will.
I mean, when I was talking with Doug, he was like, you're just talking about kind of, like banal, practical, like this is just what we do during our day. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. And that's all there is. And you don't need anything else.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think, yeah, no. And also, I should say too, right? This is only like there's like a, there's like a few paragraphs this in the essay. It's very lightly touched on, but I do want to write something in a future, not next week. I have something else planned for next week, but in a future week, I do want to write something about this, which is that I know that a lot of people who are listening to this, or I would say listening, whatever, watching this, could be listening to it, right? Could be doing something in the other room while it's on in the background. Is a lot of people who are listening to this or watching this, are leftists because they're listening or watching it, on the This Is Revolution or cross-streamed out to GTAA, right? So that they're people who subscribe to those channels. They're lefties by and large, right? I have a few libertarians who hate watch my show, and I love them, but by and large, and so I think that there's a certain kind of person who's listening to this right now who's like, oh, why are these guys invested in trying to make sense of this concept, right? Like, what's because look, even if you think, all right, sure, the sort of metaphysical question or semantic question, or about whether we have free will, or given that people could mean different things by free will, whether we have the right kind of free will to make sense of moral responsibility. Okay, granted, that has to be fought out in its own terms. Like, we can't just sort of, help ourselves with the assumption that whatever answer we'd find most politically convenient is true. That's not an honest way to argue. But still, I think people are interested in the question of how this sort of intersects with the political questions. And I think that I think some people are probably confused. Like, look, why do Matt and Stefan want this to be true? I mean, isn't this like a sort of fundamentally reactionary idea? Because, like, I think a lot of lefties, at least anecdotally in my experience, sort of associate belief in free will with things like sort of harsh retributive attitudes about criminal justice, or
people mention like kind of Calvinism and stuff, that basically, we're all responsible for everything that happens to us.
Yeah, although Calvinism is an interesting case because Calvin sort of says, yeah, anyway, whatever. We don't need to do Calvin.
We don't have time for that.
No time for Calvin. Sorry, Calvin. But yeah, because he sort of says that, but he sort of denies that we do, because God just sort of is taking the initiative to decide who he wants to elevate to the elect, right? It's my favorite scene in the witch, the Vivitch, that thing, where the like Puritan settler and his very young son are walking through the forest, and the son says, it's like my baby brother who just dies. Is he in hell right now? And Dad says, oh, maybe. Right? Like, because who knows who God could decide to elevate. But yeah, I think that, I think people associate it with sort of these reactionary kind of retributivist views about criminal justice, or even with this sort of like economic views that's like, oh, people just made bad decisions and they should, hold themselves up by their bootstraps or whatever. And I do want to write something about this connection, about like how to think about the free will debate in relation to some of these political questions at a later time. But maybe before we finish, I just want to say, like, I don't know, like, think a little bit harder about this. Like, do you really think that the only way to avoid those views is by rejecting the premise that any actions ever are under anybody's control in any morally important sense? Like, that's kind of I mean, that really seems like we gotta. I mean, to me, that kind of feels like there's like a fly crawling on the surface of a TV screen, and you just smash the entire television to like hit the fly. It's like the
Right. And
it's
it
like this.
doesn't seem like it would fit with how leftists actually act, which involves various kind of moral condemnations of stuff quite constantly.
Yeah, I remember G.A. Cohen makes this point in his book Why Not Socialism, that he has this view about equality and how this sort of fundamental objectionable thing about capitalism is that is not that there is inequality, but it's left to things outside of their control. We've talked about this before on the here on our Sunday thing, but but he sort of does pause to say, okay, you might, if you just don't believe in free will, then that distinction isn't going to make sense to you. But also, let's be real, you do believe in free will. Like and he's like sort of in a very funny way, like he's kind of snotty about it. He's like, look, you and I both know that the way you've lived your life, like you obviously believe in free will. You obviously believe that right-wing politicians who've cut welfare payments are responsible for their actions, etc. Right? I think that's all true, but it's like also like, yeah, there are bad and politically reactionary ideas where one of the premises that you need to make sense of those ideas is that some human actions sometimes are genuine examples of free will. Fair enough. But
I do find the alternative funny though, wherein chat is condemned to watch us, in which they had no freedom to choose to watch us, that they were compelled and had no other possibility other than to be here listening to us drivel on.
Poor wretches, God. But yeah, I think like it's like, yeah, so free will is like one of the premises that you need to make sense of that, but like there are also 200 other premises you need to make sense of, like lock them up and throw away the key, criminal justice policies, or poor people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps economics. And man, you could just reject the other 200 premises. I thought I had turned that off. It's interesting.
Do you keep it like on top of the mic?
I actually don't. So I'm as I mentioned to you off air, I'm traveling right now, and I actually don't have the mic that I normally. So I'm just using the internal one on the laptop today. But yeah, I think there are. I think there are a lot of other things that you need to take on board besides belief in free will to make sense of these things. And honestly, it's kind of making a huge ideological concession to your enemies to be like, the only way I could resist your political conclusions is if I scrap this really basic belief that it's psychologically almost impossible to actually reject. Like, don't do that. Like, just like fight about all the like actually crazy dubious things, I think.
Yeah. So Ben, what's on the docket for next week?
All right, for next week, I'm going to. So a few weeks ago, you got the Slavoj Žižek isn't actually a counter-revolutionary piece, and this week we're doing bipartisanship and doing analytic philosophy isn't actually counter-revolutionary.
All right, I nearly mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, there was an article on Jacobin being like, well, actually, analytic philosophy purged the communists from the whole planet. Wow.
yeah, exactly. All right, you'll be shocked to know that I don't find that account compelling. So we'll be talking about that next Sunday.
Ding ding, everyone.